A crazy 2025 season continues to pile up inconsistencies, injuries, and a whole lot of unknowns. But there's a few players at the wide receiver position that continue to surprise us and may even be breakout candidates during the second half of the season. So just because you feel like things may not be going well for your wide receivers right now doesn't mean that we can't turn this thing around. We do have good news to start our matchup analysis. On Thursday Night Football, Zay Flowers is getting Lamar Jackson back. And for those of you that own Zay Flowers and need to play him this week, this is great news for you. It is potentially a tougher matchup. Miami allows the fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. But here's the kicker. It's because they have faced the 7th fewest passing attempts on the season. And this is a team that hasn't even had their bye yet, so you can't even say it's because of that. Without Lamar Jackson, Zay Flowers has had 19 targets combined over the last couple of games. And we know Lamar Jackson will probably look to him to be his #1 target this week. And even though it is a tougher matchup, and maybe the ceiling isn't that great, as long as he gets enough targets, the floor could still be okay. Baltimore's defense is still allowing the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Jalen Waddle is going to be a start for me this week, but for those of you in a desperation situation that you need somebody to fill in, I don't hate Malik Washington in this matchup. It's a little bit risky going for it on Thursday Night Football, considering there's not a ton of stats to back up Malik Washington being a fringe start, but it's more about the matchup and how he did last week. Jalen Waddle was solid last week. He ended up being the wide receiver 3 in a short and pretty much down week for a lot of players, but he still had 99 receiving yards and a touchdown. And obviously this is a great matchup, and he has 95 or more receiving yards in 3 of his last 4 games since Tyreek Hill was injured. Now Washington doesn't have more than 36 receiving yards in a game this season, but over the last 3 weeks he has seen 5, 8, and 5 targets. This is a solid matchup for him to potentially see 5 to 8 targets once again. And if he does, and he can give us around 40 receiving yards and potentially find the end zone, that could end up being a solid week. Obviously, his floor is a lot lower than that, though. So again, Washington is like an emergency option for us. Chicago at Cincinnati will be my underdog must-watch matchup of the week at the wide receiver position. And we have several guys that could end up having really great weeks. Not only is this a solid matchup, but a lot of these wide receivers are playing extremely well right now. And I have to be willing to bet that guys like Rome Odunze, T. Higgins, and even Ja'Marr Chase obviously will be showing up when we do our research this week to see what pick'ems we want to play over on Underdog. And make sure you keep tuned right here to the channel, because Jake is going to be doing a Friday video where he talks about some of his favorite pick'ems of the week. And if you're a member, keep an eye on Discord, because Jake will be posting plays in there as well. But the only way that you can get in on the action and see as many green waves as we see in Discord, that's what we call our winning tickets, is by joining us over on Underdog. And you can download the app right now, use code HEADLINERS when you create a free account and deposit at least $10. You are going to get bonus plays of up to $100, and you're going to get a super special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit. And you can use that right along with some of our favorite plays of the week, so you can be seeing as much green as everybody else in our Discord. It was good to see a bounce back week from Rome Odunze. 10 targets, 7 receptions, 114 receiving yards. Even DJ Moore wasn't that awful. He saw 7 targets. That's the most that he has seen in a game this season, and he turned that into 73 receiving yards. Odunze has at least 62 or more receiving yards or a touchdown in all but 2 games this season, and I'd be willing to bet in this matchup, going up against the Cincinnati defense, he could do the same thing this week. Ja'Marr Chase has been absolutely insane since Joe Flacco joined the Cincinnati Bengals, and I know Flacco is dealing with a little bit of a shoulder issue right now, and as of this recording, no word yet on whether or not he will play, but my indications from what I've read so far is that he should probably end up being good to go. Over his last 3 games, Ja'Marr Chase has 54 targets. That is an absolutely insane number, and if it doesn't feel like it is, just go look at the box scores from those games compared to other games, and you'll see just how much volume Ja'Marr Chase is getting right now. T. Higgins had 18 targets in 2 games prior to last week when he only saw 2 targets, but he did score a touchdown, his second TD in 3 games. T. Higgins is a little bit more touchdown dependent for me. Ja'Marr Chase clearly is getting all of the volume right now, and that will continue to happen moving forward. T. Higgins, he's kind of fringe startable. I don't want to put him as a fringe start because he is going to be in our lineups. The touchdown potential against Chicago, it's just too much right now. We have to have him in our lineup. So because of that, he is going to be a start. Ja'Marr Chase obviously is going to be a start, and if Flacco is healthy, both of these guys should have a good week. For Minnesota and Detroit, we now know that J.J. McCarthy will be starting as Carson Wentz is done for the season with a shoulder injury. And Detroit's secondary is currently allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. They're coming off of a Monday night matchup, though, from a couple of weeks ago, where they absolutely dominated Tampa Bay. And even though Tampa Bay was a little bit shorthanded, they still ended up getting Mike Evans and Emeka Egbuka back at the beginning of the game. And we still are not fully clear on how healthy the secondary will be for the Lions this week. Brian Branch will obviously be back after his suspension, but Kirby Joseph has been banged up, Terrion Arnold has been banged up, and they've got other guys that are injured as well. Now, the guys that did fill in played very well. But I think stopping Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison is a little bit different than what they just faced. Jordan Addison has at least 100 receiving yards or a touchdown in every game since he has come back from suspension. Justin Jefferson has at least 10 targets in each of his last 4 games. That was with Carson Wentz, and we'll see what happens with J.J. McCarthy in this matchup. Now, the one thing I will say, even though I think Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison are a little bit of a more difficult matchup for the secondary than what they saw last week or 2 weeks ago against Tampa Bay, Baker Mayfield is definitely ahead of J.J. McCarthy, so we'll see how J.J. handles the pressure of that front. And we know Minnesota's defense is very solid, currently allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Amon-Ra St. Brown is a guy who doesn't sit. He's a top 3, you could argue top 5 even if you wanted to, wide receiver in the NFL right now, and I'm not even talking just from a fantasy perspective. They'll target Amon-Ra St. Brown, and we know that Minnesota loves to throw the blitz as much as possible. Jared Goff is really good at picking up the blitz, and when you do that, Amon-Ra St. Brown seems to be the guy on the other end of it for a lot of those quick targets. And if you haven't dropped Jameson Williams as of yet, I understand that you might be holding on to him in the hopes that the second half of the season is way better, but until I see more consistency, I can't start him right now. If you want to hold him for potential, that's fine, but you need to find somebody else for your lineup until we see a couple of games where he starts to see his way back to the upside he had last year. Carolina's wide receivers are looking way better right now than they did towards the beginning of the season. Ted McMillan is going to continue to be a start for me. He saw double-digit targets last week for the first time since week 2, and some of that may have had to do with Andy Dalton, and we'll see what happens with Bryce Young and Andy Dalton this week. As of this recording, we're not 100% sure who is going to be the guy, but it sounded like Bryce Young would be back after missing only 1 week, so we'll keep an eye on that. As far as we go with like Xavier Leggett, Jalen Coker, I want to see more on how these two guys end up working out together. Who's going to be the 2? Who's going to be the 3? Are they going to be back and forth quite a bit? Who's going to be the quarterback and who's going to target somebody the most? That's a really important factor here. So while Ted McMillan, he's a guy that we can count on, I think, to get at least a decent amount of volume, even if the upside isn't all that great. The other 2 guys I really don't want to go with until I know more about the consistency of each. Adding Christian Watson back to the mix is only going to complicate things further when it comes to trying to decide who we should play from this Green Bay offense. Obviously, Josh Jacobs, Tucker Kraft, those are guys that we are starting. But when you look at the wide receivers, who's going to be the guy every single week? Now, Christian Watson didn't look bad last week coming back from his injury. He looked solid, but you still have Matthew Golden. You still have Romeo Doubs. Dontavian Wicks, he was questionable. We'll see when he can end up returning. And this isn't a great matchup either. Carolina is still allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. I do think that Romeo Doubs ends up being the most consistent of the group. He probably has the best floor, even though it isn't really all that high, and his ceiling isn't high either. Christian Watson is going to have a floor that's going to disappear weekly because I think it depends on who they will be going to. It's kind of the wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2. Are they a negative game script? Is this a secondary that they can attack attack deep. There's going to be more things at play with him. I do think he has the highest ceiling though. So if you're looking for somebody to give you a good ceiling each and every week, then Christian Watson may end up being your guy. If you're looking for a little bit of a better floor because you just need to make it through the week, then Romeo Doubs may be a little bit better. The good news for the Los Angeles Chargers and for any fantasy owners that have those wide receivers, they've got a solid matchup against Tennessee, currently allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Yes, there's a but. But the bad news is, I don't know how we're going to be able to try and predict these guys on a weekly basis. Quentin Johnston was a top 5 wide receiver before he got hurt. Ladd McConkey was barely fantasy viable, was being dropped by people, and wasn't even being considered as a start anymore. When Quentin Johnston goes down, Ladd McConkey picks things up, which is something that we did keep in mind, and told people to hold on to Ladd McConkey in case that happened. Keenan Allen, he started off scorching this season. He's kind of faded back, but he still has a solid floor. But who's the guy? Like Quentin Johnston was just invisible a couple of weeks ago. He's got a ton of big play potential, but Ladd McConkey and Keenan Allen are the guys it looks like right now. But on top of that, Oronde Gadsden, he's become a must start at the tight end position. He's broken out over the last 3 weeks and he complicates things even further. Is this offense really going to throw the ball enough to keep 4 guys fantasy viable every single week? And on top of that, they've got a matchup going up against Tennessee, who suck at stopping running backs, mainly Jonathan Taylor, that Kamani Vidal could end up having a solid week against. So if LAC gets off to an early lead and then they decide to run the football, that's going to be bad as well. And that's why all of these guys are fringe starts. Quentin Johnston has the highest upside. He also has the worst floor and probably ends up being the most inconsistent. Keenan Allen is probably the best of both worlds. Ladd McConkey probably has a lower floor than Keenan Allen, but a higher ceiling. The Tennessee offense as a whole is just bad. It's inconsistent, doesn't have a ton of upside, and you just can't trust any of them. And when you take a look at the wide receiver position, there's going to be a lot of questions here. Calvin Ridley could end up being back from injury soon, but if he comes back from injury, is he traded right afterwards? My boy Alec Ayo, he looked like a potential wide receiver 2 option at times this season. He's kind of disappeared. You still have Van Jefferson, and the guy that everybody is hot on right now, Chimere DK, is he going to be able to keep it up if Calvin Ridley comes back and if he's not traded? It's not an easy matchup. The Chargers are allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game. So if you're taking a look at DK this week, I don't know if he has the best upside in the world. He has played well the last couple of weeks though. He's caught 11 of 12 targets for 163 yards and a touchdown and has kind of established himself as that number 1 pass catcher for the time being. So if you're looking for somebody to roll with this week, especially somebody that you could have found on waivers, DK could end up being a guy that you throw into your lineup, hopefully as a wide receiver 3, and he at least helps you get through the week, even if his ceiling is not great. For Atlanta and New England, we're going to have to wait before we really jump into Drake London. He's still questionable as of right now, and there haven't been any reports as of this recording leaning towards whether or not he will play this week. Now, I will say if he does play, he's a start. We will have him in our lineup and we will move forward with him being one of our wide receivers that we are utilizing. You can't really afford to sit him right now. I am super depressed that Darnell Mooney did not do better last week, especially since Mooney was Kirk's guy last year before Kirk ended up getting benched. So I'm kind of shocked that he didn't look towards Mooney more last week. If for some reason Drake London cannot end up going this week, Cordero Hodge, who saw 8 targets last week compared to Mooney's 4, probably enters the conversation going up against the New England defense, who will probably do a pretty decent job of holding this Atlanta team in check. I think there's really only 2 wide receivers that we need to talk about moving forward for the New England Patriots. Now, the other wide receivers could end up having decent days from time to time, but Stefon Diggs and Kayshon Boutte have been the 2 most consistent wide receivers throughout this season. Atlanta is allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and Stefon Diggs scored a touchdown last week, which is great. The rest of the stat line doesn't look great. He caught 3 of 5 targets for 13 yards, and then the touchdown to go with it. Matt Collins had 7 targets last week, and you're probably asking why he isn't listed. But again, he's not been consistent throughout the season. Stefon Diggs, to me, has been more consistent, and I think he's going to get more of those high leverage targets like you would potentially see in the red zone. Booty, he has 4 touchdowns in his last 3 games, so he's kind of starting to pick back up where the beginning of the season started for him. And then for Douglas, we're kind of done with Demario Douglas at this point. The San Francisco wide receivers have a solid floor matchup this week going up against the New York Giants. Some of it is going to depend on Ricky Pearsall. If he ends up playing, we will move him to a fringe start, and Kendrick Bourne will end up going to a sit for me, but we'll need to wait until later in the week. We're also still waiting to hear on Brock Purdy. The other day, they made it sound like he was not ruled out as of yet. He was progressing, but they weren't sure. If Brock Purdy ends up playing, I like Ricky Pearsall and Jauan Jennings more than I like Kendrick Bourne. Now, if Mac Jones ends up playing and Ricky Pearsall is out, I do like Kendrick Bourne again this week. But I don't love the ceiling because there's potentially a lot of options here. Christian McCaffrey in a solid game. We have George Kittle, who could end up scoring another touchdown, see a few targets. If Ricky Pearsall is back, then you have Jauan and Kendrick as well. There's just potentially a lot of options. So I like the floor better this week than I like the ceiling for these guys. We kind of got into this habit where if we had Wan'Dale Robinson on our team, we just automatically assumed he was a start every single week. And he's had some solid matchups and he's had some bad matchups, but he's had a lot of inconsistencies. So far this season, started off wide receiver 37, then went all the way to wide receiver 5. Great, it looks like he could be on the way up. He's a guy we're going to use every single week. But then he went wide receiver 82, wide receiver 81, and wide receiver 58. All right, maybe we're off Wan'Dale now at this point. Then he jumps back, wide receiver 10, great ceiling. He goes to wide receiver 21, great floor, and then wide receiver 50 against Philadelphia last week. I think, unfortunately, Wan'Dale Robinson is a far riskier play than what a lot of us really want to believe he is. And I would love to think that he's got a safe floor every single week now that Jackson Dart has shown that quarterbacks can succeed in New York, at least at the beginning of their career. So for me, yeah, we're still putting Wan'Dale Robinson in our lineup, but I think we need to be more cognizant of the fact that he could have more down performances than up performances the rest of the way. Michael Pittman continues to be one of the better value options at wide receiver if you were able to draft him this season. And a lot of people had a shot at him because he was being drafted very low with the uncertainty at the quarterback position. But with Daniel Jones having a resurgence to his career, Michael Pittman has been the number one guy. And this week, he gets a Pittsburgh team, allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Now, Michael Pittman has back-to-back weeks with 9 targets. And this season, he only has 2 games without a touchdown. As far as the other 2 wide receivers go for Indianapolis, Josh Downs, he has touchdown potential this week. Alec Pierce, he has big play potential this week. Both of them could end up having a solid ceiling, but both of them don't have a great floor. For as good as Indianapolis's defense has been, they are allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and part of that is because teams have to throw to essentially keep up with Indianapolis right now. DK Metcalf has a touchdown in 5 of 7 games this season, and he continues to be the number 1 target for Aaron Rodgers. With a solid matchup this week, he'll obviously be a start for us. Roman Wilson, before last week, did not have a game this season where he had more than 2 targets, so we'll see if he's somebody that they're going to start utilizing a little bit more often. Calvin Austin, his first game back from injury, we'll see how he progresses. He had 2 touchdowns in 3 games before he got injured earlier in the season. So we'll see this week if Aaron Rodgers gets back to targeting him a little bit more often. But they're both going to be sits, even in a good matchup, because I'm not really for certain what we're going to get moving forward. The Denver wide receivers have a tougher matchup on deck with Houston this week, allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And Courtland Sutton continues to be the wide receiver 1 for his team, but realistically, he's more like a wide receiver 2 with fantasy football, with a little bit of wide receiver 1 upside mixed in from time to time. Probably not a ton of top 12 potential this week, given it is a tougher matchup, but should still have a solid floor, just like Troy Franklin without any Marvin Mims. Now, Troy Franklin had more receiving yards last week than his previous 3 weeks combined, but the good news is he did have 18 targets combined over the last couple of weeks. And with no Marvin Mims moving forward for right now because he is dealing with a concussion, we'll have to see when he is able to return. When he does, obviously it complicates the wide receiver 2 situation a little bit more. But with no Marvin Mims, Troy Franklin is worth a shot if you're looking for some upside. Good news for fantasy owners and the Houston Texans. It sounds like Nico Collins will be back this week after suffering a concussion. And the good news for Nico Collins is he's not going to have to deal with Patrick Surtain. So even though this is a tougher matchup where Denver has allowed the second fewest fantasy points per game, and there's still going to be a tough matchup, don't get me wrong, Surtain is not the only reason this defense is good, but he is a big part of it. Nico Collins, if he plays this week, which it sounds like he's trending towards doing, will end up being a start for me. Jaylen Nowell will end up being a fringe start. He seems to be kind of the wide receiver 2 option as of right now, and the guy that fits in best alongside Nico Collins. Jaden Higgins for me, even after having 8 targets and a touchdown last week, I said it on the live show. He fits what Nico Collins does better than what Nowell does, and because of that, he kind of fits into that Collins role when Collins is out. Since Nico Collins will be back, I don't think Higgins fits into that role now. Jacksonville has a solid matchup against Las Vegas this week, who's currently allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But whenever I try to look up anything about Brian Thomas Jr. and whether or not he can play this week, the only thing I get are tons and tons of articles on about whether or not Brian Thomas Jr. is going to be traded. And let me just say this out loud. Trading Brian Thomas Jr. would be stupid for Jacksonville, and I don't understand how that even came about. This is a solid matchup. If Brian Thomas Jr. were to play this week, he is going to be a start. Travis Hunter will be a fringe start. Parker Washington will be a sit. If for some reason Brian Thomas Jr. doesn't play this week, Travis Hunter stays as a start. Parker Washington stays as a fringe start. This is also a solid matchup for the Las Vegas wide receivers. Jacksonville is currently allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But the only guy that I can list really right now as a fringe start is going to be Trey Tucker. They did add Tyler Lockett, and I know the connection with Geno Smith is there. I know the connection with Pete Carroll is there. And at some point this season, Tyler Lockett could end up being a fantasy viable stash for us. But I gotta see it first. And I also think Jakobi Meyers needs to be traded. But until we know more about Jakobi Meyers, until we see Tyler Lockett, the only guy that I could list as even a decent option in a game like this is going to be Trey Tucker, because he's currently the wide receiver 1 on the team. Not only do I not love the matchup against the Rams for New Orleans this week, but Tyler Shuck is going to be starting at quarterback, and I don't love that for Chris Olave. Chris Olave has been excellent with Spencer Rattler this season, and I've never been a Spencer Rattler supporter. Never been a big fan of his. Watched the QB documentary on Netflix, and I thought he was an extremely selfish and self-centered kid that was not going to be very successful in college, and he wasn't. However, he may have turned things around, and I love a good underdog story, and I love a good bounce back story, and that's what Spencer Rattler is, and that's what he's done this season. So even not being a big Rattler supporter, I will say this with confidence. That kid did absolutely nothing to lose his job, and unfortunately, with Tyler Shuck being drafted the way he was this year, New Orleans probably feels at this point that they have to give him a shot to see what he looks like. But he didn't look any better last week when he came in, so what does that mean for the team? Olave last week saw 12 targets. He caught 8 for 63 yards. If Tyler Shuck can keep looking towards Chris Olave like that, then all will be solid. Rashid Shaheed is apparently dealing with some sort of an injury. I don't have a ton of information on it. I haven't really heard exactly what the injury is, and I haven't heard the depths of whether or not he will miss this week either. So as of this recording, I gotta list him as questionable until we know for certain what's going to be going on with him this week. For those of you that have had to deal without having Puka Nacua now for a couple of games, you should be all right now. It sounds like he's on track to play, but as of this recording, he hadn't returned to a full practice as of yet. And that's why I'm going to leave him as questionable for right now. But he's getting a team that allows the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. I mean, you can run the ball pretty well on them. Going up against New Orleans, I assume that LA will probably still throw the football this week, especially if Puka Nacua is back on the field. If Nacua plays, he ends up becoming a start. Devontae Adams is a fringe start because he's a little bit more touchdown dependent. If for some reason, once Nacua turns back to full full practice and he isn't able to go because he needs another week, then we'll leave it how it is with Davante Adams being a start. We know when Kansas City and Buffalo get together that it can be some pretty high offensive output. Buffalo currently is allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points per game, but those numbers go out the window when these two teams play each other. Hollywood and Tyquan are going to be sits for me. Tyquan Thornton is basically done at this point. I could remove him from the slide. I'm going to leave him on here for maybe another week, and then I'll end up taking him off, but he's essentially non-existent at this point. Xavier Worthy and Rashee Rice are going to be the 1 and 2 guys every single week. Rice has shown at this point that clearly he's probably going to be the guy that gets the most volume every single week. Xavier Worthy is going to be the guy that has the biggest upside for touchdown potential and big play potential. Rashee Rice, he makes his living a little bit different in the intermediate part of the field and in the red zone. Xavier Worthy, he can make his mark from anywhere. And as soon as teams start to bite a little bit more on Rashee Rice, you gotta wonder if Xavier Worthy is going to see some bigger plays from time to time. And kind of the same thing here. Kansas City is allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but those numbers go out the window when these two teams get together. Keon Coleman really hasn't done anything since week 1, so he's a very risky fringe start. But knowing the matchup, I think we still need to at least consider him if you're in a position where you don't have a whole lot of better options. Khalil Shakir is a much safer option for me. Seattle at Washington on Sunday Night Football, and JSN gets a fabulous matchup as Washington currently allows the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. JSN is a smash. Obviously, he's going to be in your lineup, and he has a huge ceiling once again. I will throw in the fact that I think Torrey Horton has an opportunity for a big touchdown this week. It's a risky play. It's a risky one. But if you're looking for a dart throw upside play, I don't hate Torrey Horton. We're going to have some things up in the air the rest of the week with Washington, unfortunately, as Terry McLaurin's quad issues have flared up once again. He looked great in his return last week, scored an awesome touchdown, had some great catches. And if Jaden Daniels can get back this week, that is awesome. But if he's dealing with an injury once again, I wouldn't be shocked if he ends up missing this week. He probably should be questionable, but at least he plays Sunday night, so he is going to get a little bit of extra rest time than what he normally would. Deebo Samuel has completely disappeared. The wide receiver 71 and 70 over the last couple of games. If Jaden Daniels can get back and there's no Terry McLaurin, then Deebo Samuel becomes an actual start for me. On Monday Night Football, we have to be considering the wide receivers for Arizona going up against Dallas. Dallas is like that girl named Cindy from college. Everybody's scoring on Cindy. Dallas is still allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Marvin Harrison Jr. seems to be on the way back after the bye. Zay Jones, I think, is a solid fringe start option if you need a flex option this week, going up against a team that is likely going to allow a lot of fantasy points. Part of me kind of hopes Jacoby Brissett plays again instead of Kyler Murray, but I think Murray's back. And with the way this offense plays, even if they're behind the ball like they were last week, there's more than enough passing attempts to feed CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens. I'll start both of them this week. Both of them went over 70 yards last week, and that was only on 35 passing attempts from Dak Prescott. Headliner Nation, hopefully your decisions for Week 9 are not nearly as difficult as they were for Week 8, and hopefully I gave you a couple of options that you could potentially roll with if you feel like you need somebody in the flex or an emergency option at wide receiver. Before you leave the video though, do me a favor, if you've got some hype points left, use them on the video. Greatly appreciate it. But like the video, comment, subscribe if you're new here, turn on the bell notifications, all of that good stuff to help promote the channel. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.